Hi, welcome to another video. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Phillips curve. Some economists still question this curve in terms of how much it adds. There's been a lot of work on revising this theory or this concept that even won some folks some Nobel Prizes not too long ago. But I think there's still merit in understanding the kind of the basis or the foundation of the Phillips curve. So what is the Phillips curve? It's basically a model that suggests that there is a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. So watch for the word negative, watch for the word inverse. It just means that as one goes up, the other tends to go down. So where does it come from? How does it fit into kind of this unit where we're taking our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model and transitioning into policy? Well, if I were to draw a Phillips curve, just to give you an idea here, I'm going to draw my axes. I'm going to put inflation on one axis. For me, I tend to put it on my vertical axis. And then I'm going to put unemployment on the horizontal. And I want us to take a step back for a second and think about our old aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. I'm going to leave off the long run for the time being. So I've got my price level and my real GDP, and I've got some aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, and my economy is starting at point A. So I am starting at point A. Suppose aggregate demand were to increase. So aggregate demand shifts to the right. Here's my new aggregate demand, and my new equilibrium falls at point B. I probably should have taken one step back here for a second, but that's okay. We'll go back here, pick a color. On my original inflation and unemployment graph, let's say that point A corresponds to this point, right? So at A, wherever we were before, right, it corresponds to some level of inflation and some level of unemployment. Now, when my aggregate demand shifts to B, what's going to happen to my price level? As I shift from A to B, my price level goes up, which means I'm going to experience greater inflation. So relative to my point A on my Phillips curve, right, I'm going to experience greater inflation as aggregate demand goes up. What happens to my unemployment, though? So look at my production. What's happening to production? Production is increasing. So in theory, again, this was kind of written before our jobless recovery from the 2008-2009 recession, but as GDP is increasing, the thought is that unemployment should be going down. So if I were to find where B in my second graph corresponds with B in my first graph, it would be someplace around here. I'm going to call that B prime there just so that you can kind of see that they're not lining up, right? It's not about lining up. It's about getting the intuition that as aggregate demand increases, we have higher inflation and lower unemployment. What happens if aggregate demand were to decrease? Well, if aggregate demand decreases and shifts to the left, right, we see our price level falls. So price level goes down, meaning there's lower inflation, and our output decreases. And as output decreases, as we're producing less, then in theory we probably have higher unemployment. So when we go from A to C, we're going to find lower prices, that deflation, and higher unemployment. We've got some point C. And so what do you see on this Phillips curve is a negatively sloped curve that shows that we have an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. So that's where the basic theory comes from of the Phillips curve. So question then, right? All of this has to do with aggregate demand shifting. What happens if aggregate supply shifts? Let's just pick a fun color here. Start a new graph. Just to keep it clean, this is price level again and real GDP, and I'll draw an initial equilibrium. So here was aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply. Suppose it's short run aggregate supply that increases. So we would move from point, we'll call it, actually, let's not do A again. I don't want to confuse anybody. Let's call it point D. So we move from point D to point E. So this is what happens when short-run aggregate supply shifts. We see in this case, when short-run aggregate supply increases, that our price level goes down and our output goes up, suggesting that unemployment goes down. So in this case, we have both of them going down. How can both of them go down? Well, what would happen is, again, if we were starting at point A, so maybe I should have said that D is the same as our original point A, that as we go down this time, we move to a new curve. So what's happening here, just to be very clear, I'm going to write it out, is that this relationship, the negative relationship between inflation and unemployment, occurs, oops, if I could spell this correctly, let's try this again here, occurs as aggregate demand shifts. When the short-run aggregate supply shifts, we jump to a new Phillips curve. So it would look like this underneath the first. So when aggregate demand shifts, we slide along the existing Phillips curve. And when short-run aggregate supply shifts, we move to an entirely new Phillips curve. Now, why do we say then that we focus on this relationship, this negative relationship between inflation and unemployment, kind of ignoring the supply side, is because remember that almost all of our policy options under both fiscal and monetary are going to affect that aggregate demand side. Some might have some supply side consequences that could be good, right? Could be bad. But in general, our policies are used to kind of push up aggregate demand, and so therefore those changes in aggregate demand are going to look more like us moving from A, B, and C on that red curve right here. So that tends to be where we're focusing. So again, what do you need to know from all of this? Probably for the vast majority of you watching, what you really just need to know is that the Phillips curve says that there's a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. So as you pursue policies to change or affect one of those, the other is going to change in the opposite direction. So if you're trying to bring inflation down, it's going to be really hard to bring inflation down without causing unemployment to go up. And vice versa, if you're trying to bring unemployment down, the repercussion of that is likely going to be some inflation. Those two are, in fact, negatively related when we're talking about policies that are shifting aggregate demand. Well, that's it for now. I have a ton of other videos coming on fiscal and monetary policy. Hope to see you then. Bye.